thought just occurred to me that what you just recounted, the dream you had where you're Sherlock Holmes and you're partnered with your analyst, it reminds me of, and I don't have the exact page here, but I think it might be in the ego and the other chapter, or resistance and the defenses, where Lacan relates how Freud had a patient who had read, I believe, his work on jokes and attempted to like allude to it or incorporate it in some way into the treatment, or just the discourse that's going on in the treatment, and it all hinges on this word channel. And he locates, if I'm not mistaken, in that word like the point of resistance. So I know we're digressing from the historicization question, but what you said just reminded me of that moment and how resistance can very subtly reveal itself. It's on page 46, actually. It's sort of a play on words. There's this joke that in French, between the sublime and the ridiculous, there's only a step. And it's somewhat elusive what Lacan's getting at here. But he says at some point, resistance makes itself felt in the guise of transference. So he's sort of relating the two and says, hinges on this word channel, I believe.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm just looking at the page. I mean, so I suppose I'm wondering, I mean, maybe just also as a clarification, I think the example I was giving, what I was maybe unsuccessfully giving, I don't know, is just that in that moment, what seemed on my part to be, a seemingly genuine attempt to locate myself as the co-worker in the analysis. And I mean, just to pause on that for a moment, because that sounds in everyday, wow, that sounds fair enough, right? I mean, it's very democratic. I want to be the co-worker. The analyst is my ally. We're going to work together on this thing. So in an everyday intuitive sense, that sounds like fairly whatever, fair, democratic. We're both in this. We're doing a good teamwork. There's something collaborative about it. But you could see why the analyst would step outside of that, not only because there's some kind of an imaginary idealism happening, but also because in a very overt way, I'm putting the analyst in the position of the master, of Sherlock Holmes, who can crack, who could read. Now, there's two problems there. Number one, it means that I am avoiding doing the analytical work because I've got a new master who can read, can crack open the casebook like Sherlock Holmes. And also it's positioning someone else as a master, which makes me a little subservient sort of Watson figure. So there's all of that. I mean, the example that you're referring to is also interesting. I mean, I can't remember. I mean, I remember it vaguely, but one of the things that is interesting is that Lacan picks up on the tiny scrap, and he picks up on a signifier. So, rather than wanting to use something like counter-transference, trying to find an affective relation or something as the foothold for doing some analysis, he wants to bring out that word, number one. And he's also telling us something about, and that's the quote that you gave us, resistance makes itself felt in the guise of transference. I mean, and maybe just to fill in the basic backdrop to this is that there's another group I'm working with who's also reading Seminar 1, and they were intrigued by the kind of forcefulness of the Lacanian critique that one shouldn't utilize countertransference as an interpretive tool. And the reason I think they were intrigued by that is because many of us who've done some forms of psychoanalytic training or psychodynamic training in a non-Lacanian tradition have become so habituated to that idea. Sometimes people refer to it as a transference communication. And when we're in supervision, clinical supervision, there's nothing more tempting than to want to talk about your own countertransference. Now, I don't think that that's particularly a problem. I think it's pretty useful to talk about countertransference in one's supervision. But the big sort of no-no for Lacanians is that if you use your counter-transference as the basis of an interpretation of what you think is going on with someone else, which for some schools of psychoanalysis is very much routine and is condoned and in a way celebrated, is treated as an almost primary means of access to the unconscious. The Lacanians just don't do that. There's a nice Malcolm Bowie phrase somewhere. He wrote that little Fontana Modern Masters book on Lacan in like 1991 or something. And it's a nice book. I really like it, despite people sometimes are dismissive of the secondary texts, the early ones. But what he says is that around function and field, one of the primary agendas in function and field for Lacan is to remind and drive home the point that the unconscious is only accessible through language, not through countertransference, not through an effective response, but through language itself. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a piecemeal engagement, just with the fact that Lacan picks on the signifier of the word and wants to do work with that, or Freud does, I forget the exact example. And also that he doesn't want to do analytic work simply on the basis of, well, countertransference, but also resistance. And I think, Nick, maybe what you're building to is that famous Lacanian one-liner, that the resistance is always resistance on the part of the analyst. And the way I read that is maybe in a too stupid way, but the way I read it is that there's often a kind of defensive move on the part of analysts to point to the resistance of the analysand, the patient, as a reason why something's not working. And yeah, of course, people will have resistance. It'll run through the entire course of the analytical work. But once that's a given, you could say that, like, what's the point of pointing it out the whole time? Or differently put, one way that one reflects on resistance is maybe how the analyst has done something less than optimal for the progress of the analytical work. And I think that's one way of reading the only resistance is the resistance of the analysand. I mean, of the analyst. I forget how he puts it exactly. I don't know if that's where you were partly headed, Nick, or not.
No, that about covered it. I think I was just reminded of how the intersubjective relationship that should be surmounted in the analysis can relate to something seemingly trivial, like a scrap, a specific signifier that appears and can be ignored, glossed over if there isn't a certain degree of attention.
Another way of taking up your point, though, is to say that the scrap, or the little inane signifier with a double meaning, the double meaning of that signifier is as it were held in the other, right? So the point about not just one-to-one intersubjectivity, as opposed to a more triangular analytics where a big other is present, it also illuminates that idea, because the fact that there is a bridge word or an ambiguity or a possible slip of meaning, that can sometimes only be made apparent by virtue of an attention to the materiality of language itself. And that's something, as it were, that you could locate or make reference to the big other to see it occurring there.